So I want you to just, well, assuming you aren't driving right now, I want you to close your eyes for a second and just imagine the quintessential, textbook image of World War I. What do you see?
If you're like most people who took a standard modern history class, you're probably picturing the trenches.
Right, muddy, static trenches on the Western Front. You see those endless tangles of barbed wire, the cratered-out lunar landscapes in northern France or Belgium.
And maybe you're imagining the sound of that distant, unrelenting artillery in just this bleak, gray landscape. That's really the dominant narrative.
Yeah, that's the story we've all been told time and time again through movies, books, museum exhibits. But, and this is a big but what if, the true catalyst for the beginning of this whole global nightmare and its sudden, shocking end happened far, far away from the fields of France.
It really requires a profound shift in perspective to grasp the whole picture. When we focus so heavily on the Western Front, which, is totally understandable given the sheer industrial scale of the slaughter there, we actually miss the geographic and political center of gravity of the entire conflict.
Exactly.
The spark that ignited the globe and the final fatal blow that ultimately brought the Central Powers to their knees originated in a region that is so often treated as just a footnote in general history overviews.
And uncovering that geographic center of gravity is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are taking a really comprehensive stack of historical overviews, demographic data, and detailed regional accounts, all focused entirely on what's known as the Serbian Campaign of World War I, from 1914 to 1918.
It is a story that defies logic.
It really does. Our goal today is to unpack how a supposedly minor, completely exhausted nation dealt the first major defeat to a massive, mechanized empire. We're going to follow them as they survived a truly apocalyptic retreat across frozen mountains, and ultimately how they triggered the collapse of the Central Powers.
If you've ever felt overwhelmed by massive historical narratives with millions of moving parts, this deep dive is going to give you that ultimate aha moment.
Yeah, we want to show you how a localized, often overlooked theater of war became the hinge upon which the entire 20th century turned.
But to really understand the staggering statistics, the geopolitical dominoes, and the incredible, almost unbelievable human endurance we're about to explore, we can't just drop right into the summer of 1914.
Right, we need context.
We have to set the stage. We must first look at what historians accurately call the powder keg of Europe. The Balkans in the early 20th century was a tangled web of fractured empires, rising nationalisms, and incredibly precarious alliances.
So I want to rewind a bit before the war officially starts, because the documentation points to a major destabilizing event that set the whole board in motion, the 1908 Bosnian crisis. What was the mechanism of that crisis? Like, why did a localized territorial shift suddenly put everyone in Europe on edge?
Well, in 1908, the Austro-Hungarian Empire formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, to be precise here, Austria-Hungary had already been occupying and administering this former Ottoman territory for 30 years, since 1878.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't completely out of nowhere.
Right. But moving from administration to formal annexation was a massive geopolitical shock. It unilaterally changed the map of Europe. This deeply angered the Kingdom of Serbia, which had strong national and ethnic interests in the region, basically envisioning a future union of South Slavic peoples.
But the local anger wasn't the biggest problem, right? It angered Serbia's patron.
Yes, the Russian Empire.
And Russia's involvement is where this shifts from a regional dispute to a global threat. How did Russia view its role in the Balkans at this time?
Russia viewed itself as the pan-Slavic and Orthodox protector of the region. There was this deep ideological and strategic current in St. Petersburg that saw the Slavic peoples of the Balkans as ethnic and religious brethren who needed defending against Germanic and imperial overreach.
And didn't they have strategic goals too?
Absolutely. Strategically, Russia wanted to ensure influence in the Balkans to secure access to the warm water ports of the Mediterranean. So when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, you immediately had intense Russian political maneuvering trying to counter Vienna.
It severely destabilized peace accords that were already unraveling.
Exactly. It established a profound atmosphere of distrust between the major powers.
So the powder keg is packed with explosives and the fuse is laid.
Yeah.
But then the region actually goes to war before World War I even starts. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. That's crucial context here.
It's absolutely critical. You cannot understand the mindset and the physical condition of the Serbian army when World War I begins without looking at those Balkan Wars. The First Balkan War in 1912 saw the Balkan League, which was an alliance of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro. They decided to push the fracturing Ottoman Empire out of Europe once and for all.
And they won.
Like they won a rapid, decisive victory. The resulting Treaty of London created an independent Albania and massively enlarged the territories of the victors.
Yeah, there's always a but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The division of the spoils was highly contentious.
Because less than a year later, in June 1913, Bulgaria turns around and attacks its own former allies, Serbia and Greece.
Right.
This triggers the Second Balkan War, which only lasts about a month, but pulls in Romania and the Ottoman Empire as well. Bulgaria ends up losing territory, and the whole region is left completely destabilized with a massive amount of bad blood, particularly between Serbia and Bulgaria.
And the takeaway here for 1914 is the state of the Serbian nation. When we think of Serbia entering World War I, we cannot picture a fresh, eager army looking for glory.
They were exhausted.
Utterly exhausted. They had just spent 2 years fighting brutal back-to-back wars. Their economy was depleted. Their agriculture was disrupted because the men were away fighting. Their ammunition reserves were critically low.
And they had suffered significant casualties.
Exactly. They were the victors in the Balkan Wars, yes, but they were victorious in bleeding.
So we have an exhausted Serbia, an aggressive Austria-Hungary eager to assert dominance, and a protective Russia looming in the east. And then comes the spark.
Yeah.
June 28th, 1914.
Gavrilo Princip.
Yes, a Bosnian Serb student and member of a national revolutionary organization called Young Bosnia. He assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in the streets of Sarajevo.
And the political objective of this assassination was the independence of the southern Austro-Hungarian provinces, which were mainly populated by Slavs. The assassins wanted freedom from the empire and eventual unification with Serbia.
But the unintended consequence was triggering a chain reaction of alliances.
Because of the complex web of treaties across Europe, this localized desire for South Slav independence dragged in Russia, Germany, France, and Britain within a matter of weeks.
Which brings us to the July crisis. The diplomatic maneuvering over the next month is just wild. I was looking at the details of the July ultimatum, that's the document Austria-Hungary sent to Serbia, and it reads less like a diplomatic effort to find a solution and more like a trap. Am I misreading that, or was Austria-Hungary deliberately asking for the impossible?
Oh, no, it was entirely a trap. The Austro-Hungarian government, backed by a quote-unquote blank check of support from Germany, essentially delivered a list of 10 extreme demands to Serbia.
And they intentionally designed this list to be unacceptable.
Yes. It infringed directly on Serbian state sovereignty. It demanded that Austro-Hungarian officials be allowed to operate within Serbia to suppress subversive movements and conduct the assassination investigation themselves.
Wow.
They wanted a war to permanently crush Serbian ambitions and secure their southern border. They designed a test that Serbia was meant to fail.
And yet Serbia, knowing how weak and exhausted they were from the Balkan Wars, bent over backward to avoid a conflict. They actually agreed to 8 of the 10 demands and offered to send the other 2 to international arbitration at The Hague.
But because they didn't agree to all 10 unconditionally, Austria-Hungary had the excuse they manufactured. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia via telegram.
And within a week, the dominoes fell. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Britain declared war on Germany. A localized dispute became a world war.
And Austria-Hungary expected to crush their exhausted neighbor in less than a month.
I mean, on paper, looking at the sheer math, it looked like a foregone conclusion. Let's look at the tale of these 2 armies in the summer of 1914, because it is a true David versus Goliath scenario.
The numerical and logistical disparity is genuinely staggering. Let's start with the Austro-Hungarian military machine, the Goliath. Their standing peacetime army was formidable, but upon mobilization, they could swell those ranks to 3.35 million men.
Over 3 million men.
Yeah. The operational army dedicated to combat was over 1.4 million men, backed by 600,000 support and logistic troops.
And their ability to replace losses was industrial. This vast military power allowed them to send an average of 150,000 replacement troops per month to the field army in 1914.
And that rose to 200,000 a month in 1915.
Plus, they were incredibly well armed. We are talking over 1,200 field guns, nearly 500 machine guns, and heavy artillery, including massive 305mm Skoda mortars.
They even had a Danube River flotilla of monitors and armored patrol boats.
It's an overwhelming force.
It is, but the raw numbers mask a profound structural vulnerability. Despite being a giant, the Austro-Hungarian army was fundamentally flawed.
How so?
Well, the quality of many soldiers was lacking. About a quarter of them were illiterate. But the biggest issue was the nature of the empire itself. It was a multi-ethnic patchwork. The military reflected that, and it created immense communication issues. Most conscripts did not speak or understand German or Hungarian, which were the languages of command.
I'm going to pause on that because the mechanics of that are fascinating. How exactly does an army function when a quarter of its troops don't speak the command language?
Yeah.
Imagine being in the chaos of battle under artillery fire, and you literally cannot understand the complex flanking orders being shouted at you by an officer who speaks a completely different language.
It was a bureaucratic and operational nightmare. The Austro-Hungarian army tried to manage it by having regiments organized by language groups, but the officer corps was predominantly German-speaking.
So how do they communicate at all?
An officer was supposed to learn the quote-unquote regimental language of his men, but in practice they often only learned a few dozen basic commands. When battle plans became complex, or when units got mixed up in the fog of war, communication broke down entirely.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And it goes deeper than just language. The troops were ethnic Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Romanians, and South Slavs. Many of these soldiers had deep linguistic and cultural ties to the very people they were being ordered to invade and kill.
Wow.
The empire was sending men to fight their ethnic cousins, relying on abstract imperial loyalty to override deep-seated cultural identity. It was a massive psychological weakness that would lead to morale issues and defections.
Okay, so that is Goliath, a massive, heavily armed, but linguistically confused and ethnically divided giant. Now let's look at David. The reality of the Serbian army is almost hard to believe given what they were about to face.
It really is.
Serbia mobilized about 450,000 men total. These are divided into 3 age-defined classes or bands, comprising all capable men between 21 and 45 years old.
And unlike the Austro-Hungarians who could summon hundreds of thousands of fresh troops a month, Serbia had virtually no human reserves. Their only source of replacements were young recruits just reaching military age.
So what were their replacement numbers looking like?
The maximum annual number of replacements was theoretically only around 60,000.
Annual? That's less than half of what Austria-Hungary was generating in a single month.
Exactly. To make up for early losses, Serbia was quickly forced to recruit underaged boys and overaged men.
But the manpower shortage was only half the nightmare. The supply crisis was catastrophic. The operational army had about 180,000 modern rifles available. That meant that 1/4 to 1/3 of the frontline combat troops did not even have standard weapons.
They had ordered 120,000 modern rifles from Russia earlier in 1914, but logistics failed them. Those weapons didn't begin to arrive until the second half of August, well after the war had begun.
And the ammunition reserves were practically empty because they'd used almost everything up during the Balkan Wars.
Right, they had no domestic military-industrial complex to speak of. They relied entirely on imports from France and Russia, who were suddenly very busy fighting their own massive fronts and needed every shell they produced.
Let's talk about the uniforms, because this is a detail that paints such a vivid picture of what this army actually looked like on the ground. Only the first band troops, the youngest and most active, had the standard gray-green uniforms.
Yeah?
The second band troops were wearing obsolete dark blue uniforms from the late 1800s. And the third band, the older men who were supposed to be rear guard but had to be pushed to the front, had a necessity. They had no uniforms at all.
None. They fought in their civilian clothes, maybe throwing on a military greatcoat or a cap if they could find one.
And boots. The vast majority of the Serbian army fought in an everyday footwear made of pigskin, a traditional pliable shoe called the opanak.
You also have to factor in their ally, Montenegro. The Montenegrin army consisted of about 45,000 to 50,000 men. But they were a militia, not a professionally trained career army, and their equipment was even worse. They were fielding some antique weapons dating back to the 1870s.
So you have a modern, industrialized empire invading a nation of exhausted men in pigskin shoes, a third of whom don't have proper rifles. Austria-Hungary should have steamrolled them. But Goliath made a massive strategic blunder before the first shot was even fired, right? The Austro-Hungarian Supreme Command, the AOK, completely mishandled their deployment.
They absolutely did, and it is a fascinating case study in the dangers of a multi-front war. The original Austro-Hungarian plan was to use three armies, the 2nd, 5th, and 6th, to envelop and destroy the Serbians.
But they severely underestimated Russia.
Massively. When Russia mobilized its vast army much faster than Vienna anticipated, the AOK, led by Konrad von Hotzendorf, panicked. They realized they needed more men in the east to stop a Russian invasion of Galicia, so they decided they had to move their massive Second Army, which was their swing force, or Echelon B from the Serbian border, all the way to the Russian front.
Which creates a massive logistical traffic jam. I mean, you can't just tell an army of hundreds of thousands of men to turn around and get on a train.
Precisely. The rail lines were rigidly timetabled for the invasion of Serbia. You can't just reverse trains in 1914 without causing total gridlock. Because the rail lines are congested, the Second Army couldn't leave for Galicia right away.
Right.
So the AOK told General Oskar Potiorek, the commander in charge of the invasion of Serbia, that he could use parts of the Second Army temporarily while they waited for trains.
No, wow.
This delayed sending those crucial troops to face Russia by over a week, severely weakening the Eastern Front. But ultimately, a significant portion of the Second Army was ordered away. By mid-August, Potiorek was left with a significantly reduced force of about 285,000 active troops to invade Serbia.
So Potiorek marches in, expecting a quick victory, looking to execute what Vienna literally dubbed a punitive expedition, the Stroff expedition. They are looking to punish Serbia quickly and decisively, but instead they walk into what historians call the disaster on the Drina.
The campaign of 1914 is a masterclass in defensive warfare by an outgunned force leveraging terrain. General Potiorek launches 3 separate invasion attempts into Serbia across the Drina and Sava rivers, and miraculously, all 3 are repelled by the Serbian and Montenegrin forces.
When they hit the Serbian lines at the Battle of Cer in August 1914, it all falls apart for the Austrians. The Serbian army is led by commanders like Radimir Putnik and Stepa Stepanovic. They are facing an enemy with vastly superior artillery and numbers. How did an army lacking basic rifles pull off a victory like that?
It comes down to incredible tactical acumen, leadership, and a deep understanding of the local geography. Field Marshal Radimir Putnik was a brilliant strategist. He was old, he was in poor health, and he commanded much of the battle from a heated room, but his mind was incredibly sharp.
The Serbian strategy was fundamentally about survival.
Yes. They knew they were a subsidiary front. Their entire national war aim was simply to hold on, to not be destroyed, and to pray that their patron Russia would defeat the main Austro-Hungarian force in the east.
So how did they neutralize the Austro-Hungarian advantages at Cer?
At Cer Mountain, the August heat was oppressive. Putnik utilized the rugged, mountainous, heavily wooded terrain to neutralize the artillery advantage. Heavy guns are useless if you can't drag them up a mountain or see your target through the trees.
That makes total sense.
He let Potiorek stretch his supply lines across the rivers, waited for the Austrians to overextend themselves, and then struck fiercely at their flanks.
And the combat was incredibly visceral. Because the Serbs lacked long-range artillery shells, they had to engage in fierce, close-quarters combat. The lack of modern equipment mattered less when the fighting devolved into bayonet charges in the woods, where the sheer desperation of soldiers defending their homeland against an occupying force mattered more.
And the result of that desperation was astonishing. The Battle of Cer resulted in a decisive victory for the Royal Serbian Army. It wasn't just a localized skirmish, it was a profound historical moment.
It is considered the very first Allied victory of World War I. Think about that. While the French and British are in a chaotic retreat in the West during the Battle of the Frontiers, while the Russians are mobilizing in the East, this exhausted army of farmers and older men in civilian clothes just defeated the vanguard of a major empire.
It was one of the greatest upsets in modern military history. It completely shattered the illusion of Austro-Hungarian invincibility. It was a profound humiliation for Vienna.
And a strategic nightmare.
Disastrous for the Central Powers because it forced Austria-Hungary to keep hundreds of thousands of troops tied down in the Balkans. Troops they desperately needed to fight the Russians in Galicia, where they were taking heavy losses.
General Potiorek was eventually disgraced and removed from command, and the Austro-Hungarian leadership realized that punishing Serbia was not going to be a walkover. It was going to be a massive drain on resources.
But they survived 1914. They fought off 3 separate invasions. The victory at the Battle of Kolubara later that year pushed the Austrians completely out of Serbian territory.
But hanging on to victories like Cer and Kolubara is almost impossible when you're geographically boxed in and cut off from your allies. Which leads us into 1915. The empire strikes back, and the tragedy of the Great Retreat.
The situation fundamentally changed in late 1915. The Central Powers realized that Austria-Hungary simply could not handle Serbia alone.
It was too much of an embarrassment.
Exactly. The stalemate was a strategic embarrassment, and more importantly, it was blocking Germany's broader goals. So they changed the strategic calculus. On October 6, 1915, a massive, coordinated invasion was launched.
This wasn't just Austria-Hungary anymore.
Right. It was Austria-Hungary, the German Empire, and critically, the Kingdom of Bulgaria. They were all united under the command of a highly capable German field marshal, August von Mackensen.
Mackensen was methodical. He wasn't going to make Podierek's mistakes. He brought overwhelming heavy artillery. And the entry of Bulgaria is the real tipping point here. Serbia had always been terrified of an attack from their eastern neighbor, especially after the bad blood of the Second Balkan War. It was the knife in the back they couldn't defend against.
Bulgaria's entry was the fatal blow. The Entente allies, the British and the French, had realized Serbia was in dire trouble. They had landed troops at Salonika in Greece, hoping to push north up the Vardar River Valley into Macedonia to relieve the Serbs.
But the timing didn't work out.
No, the combined German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian invasion preempted that Entente advance. The Serbians were suddenly attacked from the north, the west, and the east simultaneously. The Serbian army fought fiercely, particularly during the defense of Belgrade, but the sheer weight of numbers and artillery was insurmountable.
The defense of Belgrade is legendary. Major Dragutin Gavrilović giving that famous speech to his troops, telling them that their regiment had been erased from the Supreme Command's records, that their lives no longer existed, and they were fighting solely for the honor of Belgrade. It is incredibly heroic, but ultimately the lines broke, and the geopolitical shift that followed was massive.
With Serbia finally occupied, the Central Powers gained total mastery over the Balkans. This was the realization of a massive strategic goal for Germany. It opened a direct, uninterrupted land route from Berlin through Vienna, through Belgrade, all the way to Constantinople.
Wow, straight through Europe.
Yes.
Yeah.
This rail corridor allowed the Germans to continuously resupply the Ottoman Empire with weapons, coal, and munitions. It essentially kept the Ottoman Empire in the fight, which prolonged the war in the Middle East and at Gallipoli. On November 24, 1915, Field Marshal Mackensen officially declared the Serbian campaign over.
But the campaign being over for the Germans meant something entirely different for the Serbian people. The army refused to surrender. Instead, they made a decision that is almost beyond comprehension. The Serbian army, the king on an ox-drawn cart, the government, and tens of thousands of civilians chose to abandon their homeland entirely rather than capitulate to the Central Powers. This is the Great Retreat.
To call it a retreat almost diminishes the reality of it. It was a national exodus of apocalyptic proportions. The Serbian command realized they were completely encircled. Their only escape route was west and south, straight through the treacherous, freezing mountains of Montenegro and Albania, hoping to eventually reach the Adriatic coast, where Allied ships could evacuate them to Greece.
We really need to spend some time visualizing what this march actually entailed, because the conditions were nightmarish. It is the dead of winter, late November and December 1915. They are marching into the Albanian Alps, an area literally known as the Prokleti, or the Accursed Mountains.
Just a brutal landscape.
You have an army that has been fighting non-stop, starving, and out of ammunition. You have civilians, families, pulling whatever they can carry on carts, wading through deep snow and freezing temperatures.
The physical terrain was unforgiving. Narrow mountain passes, sheer drop-offs, and deep snow drifts. The soldiers had to abandon their field guns, throwing them over cliffs into the gorges so the advancing Austrians couldn't capture them.
The logistics completely collapsed.
Totally. There was no food. Men and animals were starving. And beyond the elements, they were moving through hostile territory, frequently fending off ambushes from local Albanian tribes who were antagonistic toward the Serbs.
The casualty figures from this march are terrifying. The Serbian army had been at a peak of about 420,000 men. By the time they fought their way through the mountains, reached the Adriatic coast, and were evacuated by French and Italian ships to the Greek island of Corfu, they were down to roughly 100,000 men.
Over 300,000 soldiers lost. But the majority didn't die from enemy bullets. They were lost to starvation, exposure, exhaustion, and disease in those freezing passes. It was a humanitarian catastrophe of the highest order.
But strategically speaking, the core of the state survived.
They did. They were a government and an army in exile resting on a Greek island, but they had not surrendered.
The military had escaped to fight another day. But the civilians who could not make that journey, the ones left behind in Serbia, were about to face unimaginable horrors. And this brings us to the dark years of occupation from late 1915 to 1918.
Right.
Now, before we dive into this section, it is crucial to state that we are looking at this strictly through the lens of the historical sources, demographic data, and firsthand reports provided to us. Our goal is not to editorialize or adopt a partisan stance, but to impartially report on the factual content and the historical observations made during this period exactly as they appear in the documentation.
The reality of the occupation was incredibly severe. Following the invasion, Serbia was geographically divided between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Kingdom of Bulgaria, with both occupying powers implementing strict regimes of military control and resource extraction.
To make matters worse, right as the occupation is taking hold, a massive typhus epidemic sweeps through the country. According to reports cited in the New York Times from that era, this was the worst typhus epidemic in world history up to that point.
Typhus is spread by lice, and in the chaotic, unsanitary conditions of a war-torn, occupied country with a collapsing medical infrastructure, it spread like wildfire. An estimated 150,000 people died in 1915 alone from the disease.
That's horrifying.
It was only brought under control by the end of the year with the massive intervention of international medical missions, heavily supported by the American Red Cross, the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and aid from 44 foreign governments who sent doctors and nurses to set up quarantine protocols and delousing stations.
And while disease was ravaging the population, the occupying forces were implementing policies that observers at the time described in terrifying terms. The German-Swiss criminologist R.A. Rice documented the events extensively. Rice is a fascinating figure. He was a pioneer in forensic science.
He didn't approach this as a political propagandist.
Exactly. He approached it like a crime scene investigator. He took photographs, interviewed survivors, and compiled meticulous reports.
Based on his forensic investigations, Rice described the Austro-Hungarian occupation as a, quote, system of extermination, unquote. The strategy of the occupation wasn't merely about holding territory or pacifying a population. The documentation suggests it was designed to destroy the future viability of the Serbian nation.
He documented widespread executions.
Yes. Executions of civilians, the taking of hostages, and the systemic destruction of property.
There is one specific detail from Rice's findings that really underscores the systemic nature of this destruction. The occupying forces didn't just burn down buildings. They actively cut down fruit trees and poisoned water wells. They were literally salting the earth to ensure that the Serb inhabitants would have nothing to return to ruin the agricultural future of the region and discourage the population from ever returning to their ancestral homes.
In the Bulgarian occupation zone, the repression took on a different, though equally severe, character. The Bulgarian authorities implemented a strict policy of Bulgarization. This wasn't just military control, it was an attempt at cultural erasure.
What were the mechanics of Bulgarization? Like, how did they implement that on a day-to-day level?
It involved changing street signs, forcing local priests to hold church services only in the Bulgarian language, and forcing families to alter their last names to sound Bulgarian.
Complete cultural overhaul.
Serbian cultural institutions were shut down, and the Serbian language was banned in official capacities. A post-war report covering the violations of international law stated that anyone unwilling to submit to the occupiers and adopt a Bulgarian identity faced severe torture, internment, or execution.
The documentation points to specific instances of mass violence accompanying this policy, noting notable massacres in towns like Etep and Serdulica. In Serdulica alone, it is estimated that 2,000 to 3,000 Serbian men, often community leaders, teachers, and priests who could resist Bulgarization, were killed in the first months of the Bulgarian occupation.
We also have to look at the internment camps. This wasn't just localized violence, it was an industrialized system of imprisonment. According to a detailed demographic study by historian Miocit Avemic, of the 10 biggest Austro-Hungarian concentration camps out of more than 300 smaller camps that existed, at least 59,524 Serbs died in those 10 camps alone, places like Mauthausen, Jindřichovice, and Doboj.
And Vemic indicates that the true number is likely much higher due to the conditions of the camps and the bureaucracy.
Yes, the record-keeping was notoriously poor. Overcrowding, lack of food, and freezing temperatures led to massive mortality rates. Furthermore, some record books were deliberately destroyed at the end of the war, and many mass camp graveyards were never fully excavated. These camps mixed prisoners of war with civilians, including men, women, and children, all subjected to forced labor and starvation.
The totality of this destruction disease, cultural erasure, mass internment, and executions led to a profound demographic and political erasure. By the summer of 1917, the Bulgarian Prime Minister Vasil Radoslavov felt confident enough to declare to the international press, as quoted in the New York Times, that, quote, Serbia ceased to exist, unquote. From the perspective of the Central Powers, the nation had been wiped off the map.
It was a logical conclusion for them to draw based on the territory they held. But Radoslavov was fundamentally wrong, because down in Greece, the remnants of that army, the 100,000 men who survived the freezing march through the Albanian mountains, had recuperated on the island of Corfu, which they called the Island of Salvation.
They were completely re-equipped, rearmed, and reuniformed by the French and the British, and they were preparing for their return.
Which brings us to the turn of the tide, the years 1916 to 1918. The Serbian army leaves Corfu and joins the Entente's allied army of the Orient based around Salonika in Greece.
And for the next couple of years, this theater of the war, known as the Macedonian Front or the Salonika Front, settled into the same kind of static, grinding trench warfare that characterized the Western Front.
You had a massive multinational force, French, British, Italian, Russian, Greek, and Serbian troops, facing off against dug-in Bulgarian and German forces in incredibly difficult mountainous terrain.
There were localized offensives, like when French and Serbian forces managed to push forward and recapture the town of Bitola in November 1916, but it was largely a grueling stalemate. The soldiers suffered from malaria as much as they suffered from artillery fire.
But then comes September 1918, the Vardar Offensive. The Entente forces are now led by the brilliant, aggressive French general Louis-François d'Esperey. He amasses a massive army of 670,000 men.
This force is spearheaded by Serbian and French troops, and they decide to assault the mountain peaks directly.
The tactical execution was phenomenal. During the Battle of Dobro-Polje, French and Serbian shock troops assaulted heavily fortified mountain positions that the Bulgarians thought were impregnable. They shattered the front lines. They broke through the remaining German and Bulgarian defenses in a massive, overwhelming push, advancing miles a day in terrain where they had previously fought for months over inches.
The strategic implications of this breakthrough cannot be overstated. When the Macedonian front collapsed, the geopolitical dominoes fell faster than anyone in Berlin or Vienna could have predicted. Cut off, overwhelmed, and facing a mutinous army at home, the Kingdom of Bulgaria capitulated and signed an armistice on September 29, 1918.
If we look at the macro-level impact on the Central Powers, the surrender of Bulgaria was catastrophic. Overnight, the Central Powers lost the equivalent of 25 to 30 German divisions.
Just vanished from the line.
That was 278 infantry battalions and 1,500 guns that were previously holding that southern line suddenly gone. The German High Command desperately tried to plug the gap by sending 7 infantry divisions and a cavalry division south, but the Entente advance was too fast. It was far too little, far too late.
The soft underbelly of Europe was suddenly wide open. Just a few weeks later, the Serbian army pushed all the way north, fighting their way back through their homeland, and liberated their capital, Belgrade, on November 1st, 1918.
The road to Budapest and Vienna was now completely undefended against François d'Esperey's 670,000-strong army. The very day after Bulgaria collapsed, German commanders Hindenburg and Ludendorff held an emergency meeting in Spa. They looked at the map and concluded that the strategic balance had shifted decisively and irreversibly against them.
They realized it was over.
They insisted to their government that an immediate peace settlement was necessary. On September 29th, the German Supreme Army Command formally informed Kaiser Wilhelm II and the Chancellor that the military situation was hopeless.
There is a quote in the documentation from Kaiser Wilhelm II that I think perfectly encapsulates the shock and the bitter irony of this moment. Upon hearing the news of the collapse in the south, the German emperor sent a furious telegram to the Bulgarian Tsar Ferdinand I. He wrote, quote, "Disgraceful. 62,000 Serbs decided the war," unquote.
It is a remarkable admission of defeat, forced by the very army they thought they had eradicated and driven into the sea 3 years prior. The vanguard that broke the line at Dobro-Polje were the hardened survivors of the Great Retreat. The war was over. The armistices with the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary, and finally Germany were signed shortly after.
But, as we must now examine, this victory came at a cost that almost defies human comprehension. The numbers we are about to discuss in this final section, the demographic catastrophe, are incredibly sobering. The Kingdom of Serbia entered the war with a population of roughly 4.5 million people. By the end of the conflict, the estimates of total casualties, military and civilian dead range from 1 million to over 1.2 million.
Let's contextualize what that means for a society. Losing 1.2 million out of 4.5 million means that Serbia lost more than 29% of its overall population, nearly 1 in 3 people.
But the gender disparity makes it even more devastating. The demographic data indicates that Serbia lost a staggering 57 to 60% of its entire male population. 60% of the men in an entire country gone in 4 years. How does a country even function after that? How do you harvest crops? How do you run factories? How do you rebuild towns?
It is a societal trauma that reverberates for generations. The economic and agricultural baseline of the nation was completely hollowed out. If we look strictly at the military deaths, the Yugoslav government prepared estimates in 1924 showing Serbia lost over 265,000 soldiers. That is roughly 25 to 26% of all mobilized troops.
Wow. Let's compare that to the other major powers.
To put that in perspective, France suffered a military mortality rate of 16.8%, Germany was at 15.4%, Russia was at 11.5%, and Italy was at 10.3%. Serbia suffered the highest proportion of military and civilian casualties of any nation in the entire First World War.
And the suffering didn't end with the armistice. The brutal aftermath left behind was immense. The war left Serbia with 114,000 disabled soldiers. These were men missing limbs, blinded by shrapnel, suffering from severe psychological trauma, returning to a country that had been economically and agriculturally devastated by the occupation.
And perhaps the most heartbreaking statistic of all.
There were 500,000 orphan children left behind. 500,000 children without parents in a nation of only a few million people. The logistics of simply caring for those children, let alone rebuilding a nation, is staggering.
The recovery was a monumental, agonizing task. Politically, the legacy of the campaign fundamentally redrew the map of Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Goliath that had started the war with that punitive ultimatum, was completely dissolved. The treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon broke it apart into various independent states.
And what emerged in the Balkans?
In its place, and out of the ashes of the war, a new state was formed. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which would later be known as Yugoslavia. Because of their immense sacrifice, their role with the Entente victors, and their pre-war ambitions, Serbia assumed the leading position in this new unified state, joined by their old ally, Montenegro.
It is an incredible historical arc. We started this deep dive looking at an imperial power launching a punitive expedition against an exhausted neighbor to settle a score and project dominance. And it turned into a brutal 4-year crucible. An outgunned army in pigskin shoes repelled an empire, survived an apocalyptic retreat across frozen mountains, regrouped on a foreign island, and spearheaded the offensive that brought the whole war crashing down, completely reshaping the geopolitical map of Europe in the process.
It is a powerful reminder that war is never just about the raw numbers on a ledger or the amount of artillery shells a factory can produce. It is heavily dictated by logistics, by the unforgiving nature of geography, and most importantly, by the sheer unpredictable resilience of the human beings involved on the ground.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today. We are constantly taught that World War I was the dawn of modern, industrialized warfare. We are told the war was decided by the invention of tanks, the horror of poison gas, and the
Civilization is undeniably a key component of the war's sheer scale of destruction. Look closely at the narrative we just uncovered. The spark that lit the global fire did not happen in London, Paris, or Berlin. It happened in the Balkans. And despite 4 years of a technological meat grinder in France and Belgium, it was a sudden, rapid breakthrough by the remnants of the Serbian Army, a force that started the war lacking basic rifles and uniforms, fighting on a largely forgotten southern front in Macedonia that finally forced the German Supreme Army Command to look at the map and admit defeat.
The true fulcrum of the Great War wasn't just the trenches of the Somme or Verdun, it was the Balkans. The next time you think of World War I, or really any massive historical event, consider how the margins of the map often dictate the center of history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning what you think you know, and we will see you next time.